Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sylvia Rohr-Samaniego, and I'm the director of the University Art Gallery, or the UAG, at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'm very happy to welcome you to Queering the Archive, the fifth conversation in our series, Turning Points, Museum Practice Now. This series is offered through the University Art Gallery and the Museum Studies program at Pitt. Today's Turning Points will focus on queer theory and practice and approaches to archival work. And we are very happy to welcome two special guests for this conversation. Harrison Apple, Associate Director of the Studio for Creative Inquiry at Carnegie Mellon University and the co-director of the Pittsburgh Queer History Project, and Delali Ayivor, writer, nonprofit administrator, and graduate student in Library and Information Sciences at Pratt Institute. We are also happy to welcome Brook Corfman to moderate today's conversation. I'm very happy to offer this program in conjunction with our two current exhibitions in the gallery, Greer Langton Science Fictions and Andrei Avinoff Fantastic Visions. Both exhibitions underscore the importance of archives in celebrating and exploring stories and the work of queer artists. Before I hand it over to our moderator, I would like to take a moment to recognize the labor of all of those who helped make this event possible, especially the team of the UAG, the staff and the faculty of the Department of the History of Art and Architecture and the Museum Studies program at Pitt. And I want to give special thanks to Carolyn Swantek and Janina Lopez, both who have worked tirelessly to bring this event to us today. I also just want to say a special thank you to Janina for co-piloting the event. She will be monitoring the Q&A for the discussion later. I would also like to give our sincere gratitude to our guests, Delali, Sam, and Harrison, and thank all of you for attending this program. I'm very happy to have you here, even in this virtual space. It is now my honor to present the facilitator for today, Brook Corfman. Sam is the author of two collections of poetry, most recently My Daily Actions or the Meteorites, and was named one of the New York Times Best Poetry Books of 2020. Finalist for the Publishing Triangle Award for Trans and Gender Variant Literature, and the winner of the Fordham Poetry Prize judged by Kathy Park Hong. They are a PhD candidate in Critical and Cultural Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you very much for facilitating, and now I hand it over to you. Thank you all.
Hi, thank you, Sylvia, for introducing the event and introducing me. I'm delighted to be here today. I'm just going to set the scene briefly for the event based on sort of the exhibition, say a little bit more about the exhibitions, and then I'll introduce our speakers a little bit more fully, and then I'll disappear and I'll come back for conversation. So the University Art Gallery at the University of Pittsburgh has two exhibitions, which Sylvia mentioned, both of which will close December 9th. So there's still some time to, if you are in Pittsburgh or you find yourself in Pittsburgh, get over there and see them. And Sylvia has a couple of times in talking about them said that they seem unrelated, but I think they're kind of a bit more connected than her kind of, than she's giving them credit for. And so the first of those exhibits that opened first is called Greer Langton Science Fictions, which shows some never before exhibited pieces by the trans doll maker and visual artist, Greer Langton, alongside some of her, we could call them maybe like her greatest hits, these sculptures and torsos that were shown in the Whitney Biennial or the Venice Biennale. They're sort of collected together in this space that also thinks a little bit about the relationship between her life and her art. Langton is an artist close to my heart for the way her work shows us that our bodies are objects and that objects are often infused with a kind of vitality, which is something that she shares with the other show, Andrei Avinoff, Fantastic Visions. Avinoff was the director of the Carnegie Museum of Natural History for about 20 years, starting in about 1926. But he was also, as the exhibition shows, an artist with a broad range of styles that he really had like a pretty advanced skill in. And so if you go to the show, you can see him doing both kind of like graphite sketches and figural drawings, as well as work in the style of a variety of kind of East Asian art practices and South Asian practices. And then also this, a really amazing series of kind of speculative occult homoerotic drawings, or I think they're, someone can correct me about what they're made out of. They're graphite and something, I think, maybe graphite and ink. So what the shows have in common, other than their kind of circling approach to queerness, is also this kind of deeply informed sense of the figure. So in Avinov's case, this speculative, almost occult approach to beauty, or in Langton's case, the disarticulation of the figure or the diagrammatical quality of it, kind of under the pressure of, pick a pressure of contemporary or of her time period in the mid-late 20th century. And there's a lot in common between them. And of course, both are deeply archival, drawn from the Mattress Factory's archives for the Greer Show and the University Art Gallery's archive in conjunction with the Pitt Library for the Avinov Show. So that gives you just a little bit, hopefully, a sense of like the environment that this event kind of came out of. So I'll introduce our two speakers now, and then we'll start more fully. So our first speaker is Delali Ayivor, a Ghanaian American writing poetry for Black women and those who hope to love them. She's a 2011 US presidential scholar in the arts and a member of the second class of Dahinda Wiley's Black Rock Senegal residency. Her first book, She Is This, a collection of essays written about and with painter Audrey Gar, was published by King's Leap Editions in 2022. I think we're going to have a link in the chat so you could go buy it. She's currently a graduate student in library and information studies at the Pratt Institute, and her work is interested in similar questions in my read of kind of where we get our information, what do we think of as information, and what do we do with it. You can read a really beautiful essay in the Rumpus called Afrofuturist Triptych for My Mother that does this in a kind of amazing way, combining kind of some personal writing with these collages that both have collages sense of foundness or abstraction, but also a little bit more sense of kind of the moving hand that puts the collage together. And you can find her on Instagram at @_laney.boggs. Our second speaker is Harrison Apple, as Sylvia mentioned, the Associate Director of Carnegie Mellon's Frank-Ratchye Studio for Creative Inquiry and the co-founder of the Pittsburgh Queer History Project, which is an oral history and media preservation initiative focused on after-hours nightclubs and working-class LGBTQ lives in Pittsburgh. They also hold a PhD in gender and women's studies from the University of Arizona, and their scholarship has a kind of dual theoretical and historical approach that, for one, I find really compelling in both kind of writing history, but also taking a kind of intentional stance to that activity and thinking about how do we do this? What does it mean to do this? Sort of even as one is already doing it. If you go on the project's website, which I think will also end up in the chat, the links, you can click around through a lot of online cool stuff and see photos, but also playlists from the nightclub, some short video programs, and you can also watch the entire Miss Gay Pennsylvania 1990 pageant, which, pretty fun. So Delali, I will turn it over to you, and I'll see you on the flip side.
Thank you so much, Sam, for that wonderful introduction and for your deep read of Afrofuturist Triptych. I loved that. Hi, everyone. It's so exciting to be here today. Thank you so much for everyone at UAG for having me. And yeah, I'm going to dive right in. I wrote something for this, which is a rare occurrence these days because I'm a full-time grad student with a full-time job. So I don't get that option very much anymore, but I took this opportunity and ran with it. So I'm going to read to you, which is also one of my favorite things to do. So should be fun. Today, I'm here to talk to you about my body, or rather my body and how it functions as a portal, a conduit to my lineage and a harbinger of future disruptions to come. It will be helpful on this journey to understand where I'm from. Next slide, please. I am an African American in the most literal, least often meant sense of the phrase. I was born in Texas in 1992 at Memorial Hermann Hospital, Texas Medical Center near downtown Houston, to a computer scientist mother from Durham, North Carolina, and a recent immigrant accountant father from Ghana. The earliest memory that I can recall is walking down the hallway of our home in Johannesburg, South Africa on my 4th birthday, shortly after we left the US to live abroad. I remember being cold. I remember wearing a hot pink two-piece bathing suit with beaded fringe. I remember staring out the sliding glass door, seeing the reflection of my dark elbow and beyond the smeared faces of my mother, my father, and my older sister, born 3 years before me. Next slide, please. My family has lived in Accra, Ghana's capital, since 2002, when we evacuated there from neighboring Cote d'Ivoire, dodging civil unrest. Next slide, please. I've lived in the United States since 2008, when I moved from Accra to Interlochen, Michigan to attend Interlochen Arts Academy and study creative writing, which is also how I met Harrison. Next slide, please. I'm talking to you today from my apartment in the northeastern corner of Crown Heights in central Brooklyn, or rather slightly east of center of a community once called Weeksville, one of the largest free Black communities in pre-Civil War America, or truer still, the land of the Canarsie, Munsee, Lenape people. I love Crown Heights because on a sunny day, when a dreaded man is selling fresh sugarcane and overripe mango out of the back of a white panel van parked in the bus lane on Utica Avenue, I can almost believe that I'm home. Next slide, please. I'm here today to talk to you about archives and how I came to be entangled with them, or rather, how the archive similarly marks my body and the lands I call home. How my body and my home both came to be in a state of abjection, to be written outside of time and reason. It will be helpful on this journey to understand what kind of creature an archive is. Next slide, please. As an information science student, I've learned the definition of an archive to be the whole of the records created, made, or received by a physical or juridical person in the course of business activities and set aside for future action or reference, which is pretty clunky. Prior to that moment, records are active, what archivists proper would call documents. To make the transition from document to record, a document must be set aside. In archival theory, this moment is conceived of as the passing through of a threshold or a boundary. Not to expose myself as a girl who reads Derrida, but in the opening pages of Archive Fever, he illuminates the etymology of the word archive, noting that in its ancient Greek origins, an archive was a residence. Next slide, please. As he wrote, it is thus in this domiciliation, in this house arrest, that archives take place. What Derrida is identifying in this quote is the boundedness of archival space. A house, by nature, creates an inside and an outside. In demarcating space, its walls determine what shape something must be in order to fit inside. In this way, an archives is a space with agency. Its boundaries exercise a power of discretion. If an archives is a house, then the threshold is perhaps a door. This is fitting, considering that the single greatest element determining what lives in a house is the size of its opening. Like the door, the archival threshold exercises the greatest power of discretion of all. It determines the shape of its subject. It would be helpful in understanding this function of the archive to know that I am fat, that my body would likely not fit through that door, and that I am a Black woman, and thus any opening has to be sized just right to fit both me and the ancestors I carry with me. I've only come to understand the depths of my exclusion from the Big A archive since starting my formal study of them as a graduate student. Before I knew enough to know the archive was not a space intended for me, I forced my way inside. Next slide, please. Since 2017, I have been working on a project called Consideration, through which I utilize my personal archives to understand who I am to white men, and by extension, to understand who I am to America. And on the screen there's some screenshots from some of the huge volume of reality TV that I watch, which I've been auditing to capture white man moments. We'll come back to this later. I came to this project out of necessity. I have lived in the United States for 15 years now, and near the entire time have been told that the things that I've experienced here never happened. told so many times by so many people, so many of them white men. Next slide, please. Medical professionals who told me I would die if I didn't lose weight. Next slide, please. Lovers who told me that I was alone or delusional in my desire. Next slide, please. Professors who told me my point of view was invalid, unsupported, or too personal. Told so many times that what my body knows isn't real, that I could no longer exist inside of my own body. As I wrote at the beginning of an essay titled "Two Free Rights on Dissociation," I dissociate because I am fat and I am Black, and it is easier that way. Next slide, please. I found a note in an old notebook the other day that said, "I am obsessed with men because I am obsessed with finding ways into my own body," which is true, but it's also why I'm obsessed with the archive. It documents the things my body does a painfully incomplete job of trying to forget. Next slide, please. In my personal archive, I have an almost complete accounting of my 15 years living in this country. Every Facebook message I've ever sent or received, a full download of my undergraduate.edu email account, rental applications for apartments in 3 states, hundreds, if not thousands, of drafts of things I've written, including most every academic assignment I've handed in since I was 15 years old. So much documentation that when I finally paused to consider what it all was, evidence, I realized that on some level, I had been keeping these things with intention. Before my mind knew that many things would happen to me in America, things that would be denied or disappeared by the people around me, my body held memory of that knowledge and whispered to me to hold my records close, that where I was going, proof of us would be needed. Next slide, please. Saidiya Hartman says, "The autobiographical example is not a personal story that folds onto itself. It's not about navel gazing. It's really about trying to look at historical and social process and one's own formation as a window onto social and historical processes, as an example of them. My body knew to fear America because my mother's body knew before hers, and her mother's body before her, on and on backwards through the coil of history. I think a good archive is an archive shaped by embodiment, a house with as many sized doors as there are people who seek to enter them, if a house at all." Next slide, please. Michelle Rolfe-Trio says, "For what history is changes with time and place," or better said, history reveals itself only through the production of specific narratives. Through the work of consideration, I am using my archive of ephemera and erased experience to produce those historical narratives. I do this not to assimilate my experience to the archive, to shrink myself down to the size of the door, but to disrupt, to show that objectivity, like history or any other narrative, can be appropriated and reclaimed. Doing this work has been immeasurably good for me. Through it, I've come to see shame as a productive force. Next slide, please. There was a lot there once I started to ask myself, what is my shame telling me about myself and the world that makes me? It's also what first got me interested in memory work and what led me to become a graduate student in library and information sciences. Aptly, for me, poetry and embodiment were the turning point. In investigating the history of my relationships with white men, I'm designing processes built to question interpersonal relationships and their structural underpinnings. The goal of this project is to normalize and make accessible the critical assessment of hegemonic structures through critically assessing the people in my life who embody them. This type of criticism is typically siloed to academic settings, even though these structures shape the lived experience of literally all people. In publishing this work and participating in opportunities like this one, I hope to share these processes as a means of self-investigation and self-empowerment. This represents the fulfillment of a long-held personal ambition to liberate knowledge from the echo chamber of academy and put it in the hands of people who need it most. Next slide, please. I do this work to acknowledge that one of America's primary functions is to erase the experiences of Black and queer people. I do this work like my bio says, for Black women and those who hope to love them. Next slide, please. And to close out my presentation, I'm going to share some work from consideration with you and highlight some of the ways in which my personal archives function within it. So if we can move on to the next slide, thank you so much. All right, so this poem is called Black Women Are Prophetic, Non-Divine, Everything Happening to Us Happened Before. And it's split over 2 slides because it's kind of long. But when we get to the second slide, you'll see that the way that my personal archive functions in this poem is that there's a full email that I quote in full in the second half of this poem that I sent to a professor in 2015 after there was a very charged and very weird confrontation about anti-Black racism in our classroom. I was the only Black person in that class, the only person of color in that class. I was not the person lodging the complaints. It was very strange. So I'll get started, but just keep that in the back of your mind as we move forward. Black women are prophetic, non-divine. Everything happening to us happened before. In the morning, he leaves, citing parents in town. That night, over good quality wine, father, prominent Midwest businessman / good quality drunk, huddles with me, pouring steadily over development economics and wife, born in Zimbabwe. I turn, swat his upper arm, warm under cable knit sweater, wine drawn blood, say, how could you never have told me this? Facilitates 21st birthday trip to Hot Springs, where steam beads his thighs through a glass of door, spends hours chain smoking in corner, watching me sweat. Provides well-rolled joints on command, nocturnal groping, detour to swing set during walks home. Hand create scenarios for voyeurism, ways to watch, talk dirty through rattling flies on screen door, thumb pockets unblinkingly through window. Encourages role play, dresses me in house slippers from China, plaid shirt for warmth, hat dried stiff with running sweat. Receives 3 chapters of my favorite novel read aloud, shudders at the violence of it, invites me to spend the night anyway. Most effective in dark, where his head finds his way to my sternum, in dreams, where his tongue finds his way between my legs. Next slide, please. At a Trader Joe's in Portland, Oregon, a passerby in the frozen food aisle snatches my forearm, says, "Oh my God," stroking, "I just love your Black skin." In her watering irises, a million other white women jostle, hissing, "Mount her, mount her." From Ayivor D at read.edu to redacted, November 17th, 2015 at 11:45 p.m. Subject, read tomorrow's class. Hi, redacted. I have a lot of feelings about the conversation we had in class today. I want to say that while I do not think that you or this course has been perfect, which was never my expectation in the first place, I feel incredibly uncomfortable showing solidarity in the accusation that you are a white supremacist. In fact, I reject it completely. That seems extreme, personal attacking, and unfair to me. I'm glad we talked today. I think a lot of things that needed to be said were aired. However, to be perfectly frank with you, I find the way that redacted interacted in the conversation both fundamentally unproductive for the group as a whole and emotionally manipulative, not only to the class, but to you in particular. I really just hope that you are okay. I realize that it must have been a tough day for you. I just wanted to say that while I feel sympathy for redacted and the views they aired today, they do not speak to the experience of all marginalized peoples in the class or all the experiences of those that have had traumatic life experiences. End. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to show you 2 other super short poems that are also from consideration. And I think I vaguely mentioned at some point that I've downloaded all of my Facebook Messenger data and I'm slowly rereading every Facebook message I've ever sent or received, which I could talk about all day because wow, what a ride, what a journey. I am learning so much about myself and the world. But it's really fascinating. I would recommend it for anyone and everyone. Come talk to me about it afterwards. And something that I'm doing as I re-encounter all of this information is I'm taking screenshot of conversations or just like snippets that really catch my eye, and I'm cataloging them. So on my laptop, there is a huge folder full of folders that have themes, and inside those themes are snippets of conversations. And I've been using those snippets of conversations in lots of different ways, like the email at the end of that last poem started out as a snippet. But something that's really fun and really fruitful to do with them is to make erasure poems. So to use them as text to be appropriated to create new texts. So this is a poem called I Unsubstantial that is made from a snippet of a conversation that's saved in a folder on my computer called White Women Ask Me How Not to Be Racist. Originally sent, let's see, January 13th, 2018 at 12:59 p.m. Nothing happened between reflecting and consequences. The whole imploded and the implications defend her. And I contributed. I unsubstantial. Basically, critically, I intensely trust your sense of judgment. Next slide. And this is the last thing that I'll share. This is also an erasure poem, but it takes a slightly different tact. It's called Direct Message from a White Boy as an Entry from a Colonial Explorer's Journal. So it's just a message that some white boy sent me in 2010 trying to shoot his shot at 2 a.m. And when I looked at it, I felt like there was a lot of subtext behind it, a lot of colonial subtext behind it. So I turned it into erasure where I tried to show what I felt like was really happening in this interaction. The End from a White Boy is an entry from a colonial explorer's journal. Oh God, the good I know, the locals who know dark. I'm hoping for being. I defer to Christ's sake, the stars for me, and white would find that way. Next slide, please. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening. Keep in touch. You can follow me on Instagram. I'm usually embarrassing myself, but I also love talking to people. So get involved. You can buy my book. I would love that. And yeah, I think there's some links going around in the chat right now. If you want to engage with more of my work, it's very possible and very accessible. Don't be a stranger.
So Harrison, that's you, I think.
Thank you, Sam. Good to see you, everybody. I guess, here are my slides. I made them just for you. Oh, so good to see all of you in the participant room. So yes, my name is Harrison Apple. As a refresher, if you didn't catch the very beginning, I am the Associate Director for the Frank-Ratchye Studio for Creative Inquiry at Carnegie Mellon University. And I'm also the founding co-director of the Pittsburgh Queer History Project. We are an oral history and media preservation initiative, and we focus really specifically on after-hours social clubs and working class LGBTQ lives. And I've been doing this work since about 2012. It started when I was an art student here at Carnegie Mellon. It was a social practice project. I was helping clean out a nightclub that had a lot of strange sort of what's called in the profession information poor material, things that don't have obvious amounts of text or have no text whatsoever. And I was trying to piece them together to explain a story about this club's existence. And because I was helping somebody to reopen it, trying to situate the work that they were doing in the context of the club's own past. This was in East Liberty. In the early transition of major gentrification, the housing projects had already been demolished. The Whole Foods was in the process of being constructed. And it brought together a lot of interesting people who wouldn't normally be able to move around the city the same way as one another. That involved True Tea Entertainment and people in the ballroom scene in Pittsburgh. That involved a lot of electronic musicians, a lot of new media artists. And what I pulled out of the refuse of this nightclub revealed an interesting particular history that wove in and out of these other people's lives, which was gay and lesbian owned and operated bars, but also these social clubs. And it struck me because when I was trying to put together a history of this one space, the building for which is now gone at the hole in the ground, I found all of these membership cards, and I started to ask people around the area if they could tell me anything about what it meant to be a member there. And we would talk about the open secret of after hours bars in Pittsburgh and how they come out of multiple histories, but are often associated with labor clubs, with ethno-religious clubs, with clubs that offered support for chain migration, clubs that offered financial support for funerary rites and for families after main breadwinners were killed in dangerous factory settings. But through the 20s, 30s, and onward, they were also known as the go-to technique for illicit economies, for being able to do something together behind closed doors, but for whom the boundary of a closed door could be porous to your own devices. And when I began this work, I started with a much more exhibition-oriented practice. I was interested in collecting materials that people had offered me, and I was interested in sharing them with the public. I wanted so much to be a part of this history, and I wanted also to somehow be instrumental in making it re-enter the public sphere. But as I continued to do this work and to write eventually a dissertation about the particular ethics of building a community archives, I started to ask myself difficult questions about what comes with taking on the term community archives, both in what I could use to help the project, to help myself, to help my participants, but also what dragged down my capacity to work with people outside of a custodial tradition. And when I use custodial, I mean it in the sense that a collecting project means to take legal ownership over material. It means to centralize material and to steward its long life through this constant process of taking things from the outside in. So I'm really grateful that Delali gave us this framework for the Western European colonial and North American tradition of archival education, which is so much about taking the outside, pulling it in for tightly controlled access. And the work that I was doing brought me so much closer to the people that I was working with. They became my family. They became the reason that I stay in Pittsburgh. And I am at a point now where this project has gone through multiple different forms. It's far less interested in collecting and owning and far more interested in a kind of archival triage. And what I mean by saying that is that I'm invested in helping people hold on to the materials that they have already preserved for us. So if we think about that diagram that Delali had put up there about the difference between a document and a record, where one is in its context of creation and even actively in use, and a record is somehow part of this mausoleum of material that can be referenced or used as evidence. What I had was something that was somewhere in between. They were materials from these clubs that were not supposed to be well known. If anybody was in the paper about the club they were running, they really weren't doing their job right. And they had become, in a way, part archival record, part document. These were the kinds of photographs, videotapes, and ephemera that people used to reconnect with one another over the many tumultuous economic changes in Pittsburgh that shoved people out of their home neighborhoods, that often forced people into homelessness, and other, in many ways, basically tore people apart from the communities that had given them so much support over the past. And so what I've been up to these days is trying to engineer a new way to use these materials that doesn't fall on one side of the line, either endlessly precarious as a document that has no future preservation plan, nor as an object that must reside in one central institution. I'm interested instead for them to be constantly activated and reactivated. And I'm really, again, just so pleasantly surprised by seeing Delali's presentation of the erasure poems and thinking about how this material can be actively reworked to do something different, because no record is neutral, no record is inactive. And what my hope for the Pittsburgh Queer History Project is to become a resource that is usable, if only because it demands participation. So I've jokingly called this presentation "Honey, I Hailed the Kids." As a sort of academic, this is just a joke about Althusser and institutional apparatuses that hail you, that interpolate you, that use epistemologies and hierarchies of meaning to demonstrate your identity to you. Some of the examples that are used in his writing would be about, a police officer being able to yell stop on the street and people instinctively feeling the need to arrest their back and wonder if that's not them that's being called out. But also I think of hailing in terms of the critical theoretical approaches to community, to the way that Michael Warner would use it in terms of publics and counter-publics, the way that maybe a line or a song played by a DJ can call out to a group of people who consider themselves to be members of the same space, even if they are also strangers to one another. And the reason I'm using this here, and you don't need to read too much into it, is that I have focused so much in my scholastic work, but also now in my public programming work, focus so much on the concept of intergenerational friendship as something that can do a similar kind of job, a feeling of being interpolated as part of a queer community in action, in the making, both by those who participate by being in the room at these events, and in my case, for organizing, and even by the characters and the people on screen who seem to talk directly to us, or at least that's what we seem to so desperately want them to do. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this screening series. I call it Miss 89, named for our first screening of Miss Pittsburgh 1989, a pageant that had taken place in Pittsburgh from about 1979 to the late 2000s. I've been running it out of the Studio for Creative Inquiry because I have the great privilege to run a venue and be able to use it to my own devices. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit how I got there and why I'm doing this. Can we move to the next slide, please? So in 2021, I believe, I published an article in Archivaria, which is one of a few critical archival studies journals. And excuse me, the article's name was "I Can't Wait for You to Die." And this came out, this sort of, provocative title comes out of an experience I had at the 2019 Archives, Libraries, and Museums Special Collections Conference in Berlin, where the theme was queering memory. And because my work fits in strange places, it has to straddle oral history, archival science, urban history. I was talking about how oral history as a practice and also as a field of study and critical theory forces me to reconsider what is an archives-oriented research production mode. In what ways are some oral historian projects, some public history projects more interested in getting the thing about getting a record out of a subject than they are necessarily in being able to invest in the life of that person. And I came to this because I needed to start to understand people's refusal to participate, not as an end to my research, but as a turning point where someone else is guiding me, and I am responsible for continuing to lead my work with their input. It becomes collaborative, it becomes creative in a way that it hadn't been before. And it's towards an end, and this is critically important, it's towards an end that I can't necessarily monetize towards my own academic profession. And I think that's a sticking point for a lot of people. Now, I have to say I've become sort of exhausted by this article and my own argument in it because it can be read multiple ways and I often have to rehearse it. And I find that the audience often gets hung up on the hypothetical scenario that I present, which is that I have a set of diaries from one of my key narrators. And because our relationship was so rich, he had asked me as an understanding for me to write about him having read them, but not to share the diaries themselves ever with the public, to never put them through the process of archivization, for them to become a record. And I instinctively agreed, and I still agree with that decision, but it provokes the question of whether or not I am actively destroying them very, very slowly or immediately. Am I going to destroy the diaries? Am I going to burn the diaries? And I will tell you that that's not why I wrote it. I didn't write this article because of the scandal of possibly destroying something, although I have had plenty of people ask me to help them destroy materials that would jeopardize their livelihood. It's really a hypothetical ask in Lucky's case, Lucky being the author of the diaries. So I'm not going to quibble about whether or not that happens. The so what of the article is that it gets us to get past our anxiety over a decaying image, a decaying record, and instead to focus much more closely on what is offered to us when someone refuses to participate in research on our own terms. What happens when someone asks us to understand that what we can do for them in our capacity as historians, as oral historians, as archivists, might be something that does not benefit the profession and would in many ways be best described as taking resources away from an archives and sending them somewhere else that we can't control. So I was wanting to think about how I can teach this kind of methodology. I was trying to think about how I had been taught this methodology by the people that I had worked with for over a decade. And I would often try to focus on the nuance between the difference, let's say, of archiving an object and passing on an object. Some of the things that come to mind might be familial relationships in which you pass something on to somebody because you have perhaps a tacit knowledge about how this object should be handled. You might have a cultural knowledge about how this object should be handled. But I believe that it's possible for archives to take on and model that kind of work as long as we are willing to think about having to break apart our control over archival processes. And I wanted to, having finished my doctoral degree and written this text about how I believe I am intending to pass on material, I was trying to think about how this project, the Pittsburgh History Project, could move away from the archives-oriented approach that was offered by the way in which community archives are often discussed in the public sphere, and instead invent something of our own, something that I believe can treat the kind of archive fever that Delali was referencing, which is it's a translation from the French mal d'archive, which is often described as an archive fever, but it also sometimes is translated as an archival madness. It's an obsession with getting close to the original thing, that which left the archival imprint, which Derrida is also talking about is actually impossible. It's something that is an endless want. It's something that the archive also produces in us. The archive produces the very problem of our inability to be sated or satisfied by the way that records are created and the way that they are shared. And I know that I had been able to treat some of my own experience of this archival fever, this archival madness, by getting to know people for whom these materials were slices, narrow slivers of representations of the stories they would tell me, of the life experiences that I would watch grow, develop, and change. And I realized that I could share this if I could only make the effort to organize an event that was able to directly benefit the people for whom this material is inseparable from the way that they're represented in the world, and also meet that with the desire of people to have access to these things. And I meet in the middle as this negotiator, as this mediator, who tries to take the desire to share your past and the desire for a shared past and make them talk to one another rather than through an internet portal, which I admit I have made on WordPress of all things. Oh my God, why would I do that? On Omeka of all things, terrible platform for the work that I need to do. But we're always kind of dealing with the standards that we set on ourselves. So in order to do this, I created the Myth 89 screening series as a way to pay people who have been either part of making the material that we share in our archives or wish to share from our archives, and have them arrive, be in charge of an event or a co-host of an event, and they have the opportunity to essentially teach a new audience of people how to watch these materials, how to watch them as somebody who wishes to develop a friendship, an intergenerational friendship, a friendship that is often referenced by people thinking about Michel Foucault's famous interview, friendship as a way of life, something that is required for us to build a relationship between people who otherwise don't have a standard social relationship handed down to them, something that can be easily intercalated. We're always trying to invent these things at will. Sometimes they are erotic, sometimes they are stoic, but they are nonetheless imminent. And so this event, if we can go to the next slide, please, is the way that I've been trying to do this. This is a photograph taken from the first event. I will say that these screenings are live and in person only. We do not stream them over Zoom. We do not record them to be watched in their entirety afterward. They are a chance for someone to become a momentary mentor in the way that I received this mentorship from the people who I thought that I was helping to save from oblivion. And LaDonna Lamore, who was a participant of the Myth 89 project, started us off with a beautiful description of her own life in the service industry in Pittsburgh, as well as her entrance to the entertainment nightlife that came alongside it, and was able to talk to us about what we're going to see on stage, which in its plainest form is a series of lip syncs, nightgowns, swimsuits, and talent numbers that would eventually be judged to crown your next reigning Miss Pittsburgh. And it's a phenomenal pageant. It is available online. I highly recommend you watch it. I won't tell you who wins, but keep an eye out for Snowy, whose rendition of Addicted to Love, the cover by Tina Turner, is unparalleled. She also just looks like she's having the most fun. But what was really important for us is for LaDonna to be able to talk to us about the relationships that were built between the women on stage, and the way in which these relationships far exceeded the 3 hours of footage that we would watch together. And the introduction that she gave inspired people to feel like they were really at this event. This is the kind of feedback that we received from these all the time. People were cheering for their favorite contestants. They were screaming, they were booing when they thought people were robbed. And when it came to an end, people wanted nothing more than to run to the office of Pegasus, where this pageant happened on 818 Liberty Avenue downtown. If you peek through the door, you can still see the stairwell and the painted Pegasus on the ceiling. And to run in there and find the old voting sheets from the office to figure out if maybe their favorite contestant had been cheated that night or not. I know that out of this event came offers to build, construct, and design new dresses for LaDonna, who's interested in re-entering the pageant scene after almost 40 years. And what I can't express enough is that this event made people feel like they were actively participating, that they were actively constructing something. And that has been my deepest, deepest goal with this project for the longest time. It is not to build an inside from which the outside is not allowed in. It is trying to create something that is catalytic, something that is dynamic, something that helps to translate one desire for another. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we've done 2 at this point, the first being Miss 89, the second being Cold Hearted Snake, which was a 1995 Valentine's Day fundraiser taking place at Lucky's, the bar in the Strip District. And it was benefiting the Pittsburgh AIDS Task Force, which you now know as Allies Health and Wellness. This screening featured guest host Jasmine Butterfly, who is an inveterate HIV and AIDS awareness activist, a Black trans woman advocating for trans rights in Pittsburgh, and was able to explain to an audience of people who had no embodied experience of this, often most of them, what is a benefit show? What is the urgency behind these performances? And to prepare themselves for the rather devastating experience of watching people give everything they have on stage for a crisis that has no solution, that has no answer. And it changes the way that they read these performances. It changes the way that they read the bittersweetness of someone like Jasmine presenting this material and taking the time, the emotional labor, the physical labor to present the material, to sing along with the songs, and to offer herself as a conduit for a world that no longer exists in the same way. What I'd like to say about that particular one is that this tape involves a really beautiful moment of impromptu speech by one of the hosts. Her name was Claudia. She sang live throughout the performance. She offered the lottery tickets, the 50-50. It was a very Pittsburgh event. And as she is trying to make sure that people are collecting their door prizes, she looks to the camera and says, "One day this is going to be in the archives and you will all be exposed." And she sort of screams it out and people are raucously laughing. But that stuck with me so much, and it's only been about a month to really turn it over in my head. But I think what happens in this moment is it reminds us that what happens while the tape is playing is only for those of us who are in the room. It's something that is offered to people who are trying to participate in an event, or even the memory of an event, the fantasy of an event. And everything else might be marketable, the pictures that I can show you, the brief moments of recorded video. But I want you to understand that these people are here to teach each other how to do something together. It's not just what we're sutured to on the screen. It's the experience of watching it together, of giving each other permission to feel connected to this material. So when Claudia says on stage, "One day you will all be exposed," it transforms her sort of threatening joke into something closer to a promise for that friendship that I was talking about, a promise for that desire that we want so badly, that you will be exposed to an unpredictable kind of love, that you will be exposed to this desire to share an event that escaped us. Most recently, there's been a scholar who I'm obsessed with, Ashanti Crawley, who recently spoke at the University of Pittsburgh as part of the poetics seminar, African American Poetics. I'm forgetting the full acronym, my apologies, but it was a phenomenal event. I shared the stage with Coco Fusco, and he writes in his book, The Lonely Letters, and what I mean is this: I want a consensuality with you, a continued consent to be together, a way of life that will always have friendship as the first and always plural operation. And Biko Gray, who wrote a review or an anti-review about this book, says about this word, this consensuality, and about the book in its entirety, you have to give up. You're caught up, you're invested. You now know it. The entire book, the everything, even the vulnerable discussions of loneliness, all of it is in service of cultivating joy and intimacy and non-coercive relation. So what people see in these events, what they experience, It's that they're not just seeing something on screen. It's not, in fact, a visually dominant experience. It is an experience of being together in this room, of giving each other permission to applaud for your favorite contestant, to scream in joy and ecstasy about what you have seen as impromptu. And that's the kind of archiving that I would want to cultivate. And I'm not above letting the title of archivist go in order to get there. I'm not above letting the idea of a community archives go if that's what it takes in order to continue to operate as this kind of public programming, one that I think makes these materials able to continue living, something that has kept people together over the years of being torn apart, and could also be used to extend a new network, one that continues to give these objects a contemporary meaning, one that activates them. Can we move to the next slide, please? And this is where I want to sort of tease you, but also leave you. We have our next event coming up on Monday, December 5th in the studio. We're located in Carnegie Mellon's College of Fine Arts. There's contact information on our website if you need any help getting there, as well as a little photo scroll, which doors to enter for our accessible entrance. But we have the great privilege of having Tara Maddock visit the studio as a visiting artist through the Sylvia and David Steiner lecture series. Tara is a phenomenal filmmaker. He's a trans man. He is a performance artist. And he often works with historical reenactment as part of his practice. And there's going to be an analog live video editing performance. It's currently in workshop mode of some personal archival material as well as some personal work. And we hope to create a limited distribution of physical tapes that come from this active and physical performance of cutting and recutting material that would once be described as organically whole, as original, as a perfect candidate for the movement from document to record. So he will give a lecture about his work, including, if you're not familiar, his really phenomenal documentary film, Toilet Training, talking about anti-trans violence, the described bathroom bills that were showing up in states all across the United States, attempting to force people to be able to prove through multiple forms of state ID and identification that their biological sex and their birth sex and their gender identity are all somehow part of this uninterruptible uniform line. Otherwise, you can be arrested or just subject to incredible, unrelenting violence. His talk will lead into the workshop, which will lead into the next Miss 89 screening, which is a 1988 City Council hearing to create a gay rights amendment to protect sexual minorities from discrimination in housing and employment. And it was produced originally by directors Zed Armstrong and Al Ferrucci for the Gay Cable Network. It was the cable access show on PCTV 21 throughout the 1980s in Pittsburgh. And what you're going to see if you come, and I really, really hope you will, they're always free, open to the public, and I tend to pop the popcorn myself, is you will see people ramping up to deliver testimony about why we need this legislation or why we want and believe that this will do something different for our everyday experiences. And also, you will see at a turning point at which certain city council members change their vote and the ballot does not pass, you will see the outrage in the hallways. You will see people discuss their immediate feelings about being trapped in a system that does not promise to help them. And it will, I think, inspire a similar experience for people in the room to have a sense of permission about feeling that they are part of actively making history, not just living through it. So I hope that I'll get to see you on December 5th and that you can meet me and talk with the people who will be introducing this material to you, teaching you about what it feels like to watch it with somebody in the room who has had a major hand in its making. So thank you again for having me, and looking forward to any of your questions. Thank you.
Hi, I'm back. Thank you, Harrison and Delali. That was really, really amazing. And if you both want to turn your video on and join me, so the rest of you in the audience, obviously the three of us have a lot to say about these exhibitions and about the archives. So just as a heads up, we're probably going to keep talking for about till about 5:10, even though the listed thing is around 5. But you're on Zoom, you get to kind of control your own destiny. So as you were. Okay, I have like a lot of questions, but I think we'll try and do like kind of 2. And the first one that I have that I was thinking really hard about in both of your talks is about the relationship of ethereality or unsubstantiality to the kind of detail that this kind of historical record, or like maybe the thing that is passed on has, that, and then in both of your cases, you're working with like materials that have extremely specific, the DMs there's extremely specific language. In the video, there's like, we're watching the whole pageant, right? There's all this kind of information in it. But then, in Delali, we're talking about, often the titles reference this question about ethereality or insubstantiality. And Harrison, you're thinking about how to produce something a little bit more ephemeral than just kind of the details of the thing. So I wonder if the two of you could each speak just a little bit to how you think about that relationship a bit more explicitly, and how it, how you came to it, or how I was originally interested in the detail question, and then I became interested in the tension between the two as you were both talking.
I can step in first Harrison, if you want to break from talking. I would say, that's a really good question and a really good observation, just kind of about the work in general. I think for me, I've always kind of, and I talked a little bit about this in my presentation, I've always kind of existed in these weird liminal spaces in between structures, like I'm not quite American, but I'm not quite Ghanaian, and I'm not an immigrant in the United States, but I've only lived here for 15 years. And in a lot of ways, my experience does map onto a lot of my friends who are immigrants or are first generation. And I think so much of that, the byproduct of that type of existence, are these little, very specific, but pretty ephemeral things that kind of just get scattered to the wind, like scattered to the digital wind, especially considering the age and the time that we live in. But those things are so essential to like who I am, to my sense of self. I think about Tumblr, to be honest. I feel like everyone who's an archivist in 2022 was very active on Twitter 10 years ago. I think a huge part of assembling just like a sense of self in the modern age is collecting all of these little pieces of ephemera and cobbling them together into an identity. And I think it's more interesting to kind of acknowledge that and interrogate that than to just kind of be like, oh, but it's miscellaneous. And I think that there's a lot that you can read out of those materials kind of once you look at them in context, but then again, think about taking them out of context and putting them alongside other things and kind of seeing what evolves in that dialogue. So that's my immediate thought.
Yeah, in terms of, and I think I'm going to answer this in terms of shifting from detail to ethereality or ephemerality, and the two being different but still relevant to the same question. When I began this project so many years ago, I was obsessed with detail and extensive metadata and the findability of every object, like building the safest infrastructure for this information, to the point that I sort of lost track of the fact of how I was changing it. I was receiving materials that had already gone through so many different consumer grade crunches, from VHS to DVD to multiple burns of one tape onto several different formats. And what I had thought I was able to do in that kind of feverish archive fever experience was I was cutting photographs out of the stream of video in order to print them back onto film for our first exhibition. I kept calling them digital born agains because they were this presentation of an original object that people were so fragile with. And I'm like, I paid for these. These are brand new. They have no authenticity. They don't have the authority that we want them to have. And that was a really teachable moment for me in terms of stopping myself from using the bulk of my effort to chase down these ghosts, and instead to recognize that I was already actively part of this reforming, this cutting and recutting and erasing an object in order to try to make it speak the way that I had wished to hear it speak, hoping that it would somehow speak straight to me and only to me. Over the years, I went from the sort of, develop a traditional relational database that can maintain all of this information that I'm either chasing down or in some cases realizing I'm even fabricating in collaboration with people who held on to them. And instead hearing people speak to what their desire was in contrast to what I was offering them. So I have a friend who I was interviewing about her experience as a drag performer in the 1960s, and she just expressed her sincere boredom with the interview format. It was like, I'm literally done doing this. We've talked about all this. Like, you're asking me detailed questions about a bar that doesn't even exist anymore, that maybe I didn't even like. And the first time we had met, she said, what I really want to do is get all the girls to come out and look glamorous one more time. And so I was thinking back, like, okay, what I'm doing is not just not working, it's committing the cardinal sin of boring her. And I wanted instead to not bore her, and to show my appreciation for someone as more than a repository of their own memory, and that they are still here, still actively doing things. So we threw this ball called One More Time, which there's a collection on our website about, because I was TAing a video class at the time. So I forced all of my students to do 3-camera video capture and learn to edit for performers. It was a fabulous experience. But events like that, which cannot be captured in their whole, you can only produce this this digital surrogate object, of a booklet and a video, and hope that people get something out of that, knowing it's not the thing in and of itself. So participation had always been rearing its head as what was most important to the form of preservation that I was hoping for. It was about participating in someone's life, because you have already intervened the moment that you have asked or attempted to ask somebody to participate in preservation. You have intervened in their life irrevocably. And so you have a responsibility to think about what is it that you are doing? You are now tethered to this person. And that's why I keep using the word friendship, because I think it makes a lot more sense than responsibility, tethering, intervening. It starts to sound like this person is your ward, and you don't have that level of control, and you shouldn't want that level of control. Or perhaps shouldn't are not relevant here. Psychoanalytically, I don't think that we want to get that far, but you can't deny that that you have made a messy demand, and so you are responsible for the mess. So I would instead, I would show up to people's houses, and we would do home preservation techniques so they could hold on to stuff and share it on Facebook, or we would organize friends to come over and make dinner and watch a tape together because they had been apart for so many years. And when I finished school and was able to come back to Pittsburgh full time, the things that I was trying to do in huge crunches over the summers and school breaks, I was able to think about doing as something recurring, something that I could offer to a broader audience. Because by then I would get that heartbreaking question for anybody who runs a project sort of by themselves, which is, are you still doing that? Is that still happening? And I thought, okay, I have to solve that. But because the quiet work, the bulk of the work, doesn't produce a public image, and producing a public image would take away from the limited hours I could commit. So this opportunity to do it at the studio was my first chance to say, I've been doing this long enough that I know what it is that I want out of this, and I know that I can translate that desire to somebody else. So we just now have to literally try to do it and live with the consequences. And it's been going really well. And we just got a gift from another department at the university that might allow us to do this for another 2 years. So there's lots of programming coming. And I expect only that this event will kick my ass and change in a million ways over the course of that.
Thank you. I love the messy demand of this question about interviews. I've been thinking about that. Someone recently for a project I'm also doing about the relationships and all this kind of stuff. I'm gonna keep messy demand on the back of my head. Okay, going down my list. Maybe, so one of the questions I had, and Harrison, you did talk a little bit about this, but I'm trying to maybe back up a little bit. Since the series is called Turning Points, and we got from both of you this, this kind of amazing sense of how does your archival practice shift as it approaches these theories, or as you learn how you're working with the community. But I wonder if you could each give us a little bit, and then we'll kind of have to sign off, but a little bit about what the first attraction was to archival work, when and so maybe Harrison, if that was your first thing, maybe we got it a little bit, but if there was already kind of some sense of something that you wanted from archival work, or something that you hoped you would get in doing it. I'm always interested in that, and how the thing that we're interested in changes, but it still, does something for us, right? That it changes, but instead of us dropping out from it, we like move with the change of it. And so I wonder if you could kind of step one point back from maybe where you each started and talk a little bit about that first investment or that first hope or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was all about the belief that archives were going to save something that I was feeling like was at risk of disappearing. And in many ways, it still does offer that possibility. There is the nuts and bolts view of material that would otherwise absolutely end up in a garbage can against the wishes of the person who made it or tried to preserve it to the best of their ability. However, the turning points for me towards a different kind of archiving and a turning away from many techniques that are traditional and assumed to be, what's the word I'm looking for, non-negotiable, integral, to a point that if you take them away, the whole house starts to fall down, was difficult to do. It was difficult to do professionally. It was easier to do as the Pittsburgh Queer History Project, because these decisions were being made in conversation with people who were expressing what they wanted, these complicated asks out of my own messy demands. And I was coming up against the issue of how do you document making the choice to say, I'm going to show up and create multiple low-res definition images of stuff that you want to preserve. And I'm not going to insist on a master rip of your tape because I know that I can't ask you to hold on to terabytes of digital information. You know, I'm going to do like a DVD dub with you, which is poison to a moving image archivist. But I also know that if the goal is to create an object that can only be preserved by continued sharing, if that's its only promise of being preserved as a meaningful object and not just a kind of material that's sort of at will consumed in a digital format, which can spread across space and time in ways that these materials were never expected to be done. Remember, of course, that I'm talking about a lot of things that were made in after hours clubs where a sense of privacy was innate. It was part of being a member. You didn't have to have this access. So I was relying on a system that already existed. I wasn't going to rebuild someone's social network. I was going to invest in it. And that was difficult to explain to a field that always wants to build a better archive, that wants to build a better reading room. And it was difficult also, I think, in a personal, professional way, because these critiques often felt like I was denigrating the solutions offered to the field itself, when really what I was trying to say is these don't work for me. Like, I'm so happy if you think that adding tissues to the reading room is going to change the way that colonialism is enacted on people looking at archival records of ancestors. It's just, you're trapped in so many ways. I'm thinking of a particular article that I knew the author, and they talk about their own misgivings of this experience of thinking about, like, how do we make the reading room more caring? And I don't think that you can, not to an effect that it changes it from the way that the reading room operates. I think that you have to invest your resources in being able to say that the reading room is not the final solution for these materials. And there are plenty of projects that already do that, but I think the field is always looking for a way to turn practices into standards, to turn practices into something that can be repeatable. It is archival science, after all, right? And our own project doesn't have repeatable standards. They can't be copied and pasted because they are completely defined by the participation of the people who are inseparable from the archival records themselves. Yeah, it's a weird thing to be put into. I'm supposed to, at some point in the future, talk to the students at UBC over Zoom, by the way, for the Association of Canadian Archivists. And I'm like a little nervous about talking to a bunch of people who are not Delali, who I know well enough is not, going to be heartbroken over somebody who will say, like, you can say no to the archives. I did, and I no longer work in one. Like, it can be a devastating thing to share with somebody that you can walk away from that dream. But I think for me, it really worked out pretty well. It's allowed me to do stuff that otherwise would have been taken away.
Well, and it's kind of an amazing, right, this like saving something to like doing something for a person. It's kind of lovely change. Delali, anything to add on your own front?
Yeah, just briefly to say that I think I kind of alluded to this in my presentation, but I feel like this is really like an intergenerational practice for me. Like, I think that I am an archivist because my maternal grandmother was an archivist, and a huge part of her life, especially later in her later years, was collecting the history of poor Black people in Durham, North Carolina, because that's the way that she grew up. And she felt like that history was being lost and not being protected. And also trying to trace the genealogy of my family and find out how they got there in the first place. So I think, you know, for me as a Black woman living in the land that I live in, there is this kind of like larger structural dissociation of Black memory that's like embodied in me. And it's, yeah, I don't think I really have a choice. It's happening because it's who I am. So I think that's kind of, for me, that's it.
I love that. Yeah, that you have, there's that kind of like genealogy of curiosity, of noticing something, of trying to like, yeah, figure out something.
I think a hunt for self-knowledge, which again, I feel like is a very like Black woman thing. And also has always been my engagement with the Academy is like, how can I understand more about myself in context, like through appropriating these things that I'm learning in a very specific frame, but that I'm not going to take it that way. But there's something that is usable here that is very valuable to me that I can take out of this.
And it's very like what Harrison was saying, you know, also, I think that's the thing that a lot of historical study is doing, but it's hard to say that in the academic sphere, right? To say that like, I have this question about my own life or something that I'm tracking. Okay, thank you both so much. That was really amazing. Janine or Sylvia, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Delali and Harrison and Sam for leading us through this discussion. Thank you to all of you who were able to attend and stay with us for a few extra minutes. You'll receive a survey via email about your experience with the event, and we welcome your feedback. You can also follow the gallery on Instagram at @Pitt_UAG and visit our website, uag.pitt.edu, to keep up with upcoming events. Thanks, everyone.